everybody. This is a treat to be here. I'm Desir director of the Bernstein Center, and we're here for a fun gathering. On behalf of the Bernstein Center, CBS Running and Triathlon Club, and BBSA, I'm so happy to welcome you to today's event, where we will have Alison Mariella, Desir, who is the author and founder of Harlem Run, here with us. And she's just going to talk about her book, Running While Black, Finding Freedom in a Sport That Wasn't Built for You, and just generally athleticism in America and how running can empower everyone. I feel like it resonates with me because I started running in 2005 maybe, and I would run 5 minutes on the treadmill, then walk, then 5 minutes on the treadmill, then walk, then 5 minutes on the treadmill, then walk. And my trainer at that point was running the marathon. So one day I was like, if she's running the marathon, I'll run 15 minutes and walk, then 15 minutes and walk. And I eventually got to 6 miles. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then in 2018, I ran my first marathon. I actually met Alison and the Harlem Run team, and I'm not a group runner, so I went on a couple of runs, but love what they do, and I am also running on Sunday, so all of you. I feel actually very comforted in this group because there's so many of you who love this sport like I do, like they do. And who else do we have with us? Ijeoma. Yes. We have Ijeoma, who many of you know. She's a second year at CBS, focusing on marketing and entrepreneurship. She is a 2-time New York City Marathon and co-president of the Columbia Beauty Club, VP of Brand for the Active Business Club, VP of Global Health and Healthcare Industry Association, and the DEI chair for her cluster. I mean, what else you do?
Is that it?
A lot. What don't you do? Okay. So we're really excited to have her lead this conversation. This is also a PPIL event, so this is a reminder to, scan the QR code, check yourself in, and all that good stuff. With that, I'll turn it over to Ijeoma, and thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Professor, for that intro. Thank you so much. As Professor Akinola already introduced, we're going to jump right into it. Alison is actually a 3-time Columbia grad, Triple Lion, and as we mentioned, the founder of Running Club. So it's a pleasure. Had the chance to read this book from cover to cover, and I have a lot of questions. Yeah. So we're going to get right into it. Let's go. So why don't we start with just a quick intro for everyone. As I mentioned, you're Triple Lion, graduated from Columbia 3 times. Can you give us like a quick roadmap in terms of your career before running and before Harlem Run?
Sure. First of all, thank you all for coming. It is like my biggest fear that I walk into a space and there's one person. I can relax. In terms of a roadmap of my career, it's funny you ask it in that way because if you read my book, you realize that it was like a shit show. I had no idea what I was doing. But I went to Columbia undergrad, actually spent a lot of the time like partying and drinking and not going to class. Graduated, decided to work at a law firm. And I remember I was a paralegal, and at one point the partner said, "Your job is so simple, a monkey could do it." And I was like, it's a little bit racist, a lot of it fucked up. So then I went and I got my first master's back at Columbia in international affairs, focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean. And then I tried to get a job that would be meaningful, but I couldn't find one. My father was very sick. I was dating somebody who was not a good person, and I fell into a depression. And it was running that led me to discover this connection between mental and physical health. And the more I was moving, the more I was engaging with community, the better I was feeling. So what did I do? I came back for my 3rd and final degree, my master's in counseling psychology from Teachers College. And that was really a huge transitional moment in terms of just understanding who I am in this world, and a lot of the feelings that I was having about myself being ugly, worthless, stupid, all of those things were really because of the messages that I was receiving from society about who matters and what ideal beauty standards are, and So that is how I got to where I am today. And believe it or not, I actually want to get my PhD, I think, but once I pay some student loans.
Okay, we want to jump into the book. Like, one of the things that really struck me at the beginning of the book, you start out with this comparison of the U.S. running history and the Black people's reality, and it's very like in your face.
Yes.
And I want to know what made you decide to start the book in that way, and like what were you hoping to I guess convey in those early pages?
Yeah. So everybody, if you could open your books, you can see it's a few pages in, but it starts at this timeline called freedom of movement. And as Ijeoma said, my intent with this was really to be confrontational, right? So this timeline was a result of two key dates that led to my further investigation. So the first is 1963. Anybody heard of Bill Bowerman? Okay, Bill Bowerman, famed coach who in 1963 in Eugene, Oregon, put a call out to everybody to show up and run with him. And many people mark this as the beginning of long distance running history, right? So thousands of people showed up that day. And I looked at newspaper publications of who showed up, and it was all white people. And I got curious. I was like, well, what was happening in 1963 for Black people? And I was like, oh, that's the year that Martin Luther King was marching on Washington. Oh, we couldn't vote in 1963. I started looking into what was it like in Eugene, Oregon. It wasn't until 1957, 6 years earlier, that Black people could even own property in Eugene, Oregon, right? So I started to see that this idea that running was for us was flawed because we did not have freedom of movement. Another date that stuck out to me, because I'm a history nerd, was 1896. And I knew that to be the year of the first Olympic Games and the first running of the marathon. I also knew that 1896 was the year of Plessy versus Ferguson, which institutionalized racism and led to Jim Crow segregation. So just this added context allowed me to rethink the mantras that we often say in running. Running is for everybody. Just show up. All you need are running shoes. And I thought to myself, well, that's not the case. You also need physical safety, psychological safety. You need access to the outdoors. You need clean air, clean streets. All of these things that were not accessible to Black people in the same ways. And then another thing, though, as I dug deeper, I realized that despite all of those obstacles, Black people in Harlem were actually laying the foundation for the modern running movement. Wow. Folks like Ted Corbett, who was part of the New York Pioneer Club. Actually, if it were not for Ted Corbett and the New York Pioneer Club, there would be no New York Roadrunners, there would be no New York City Marathon this weekend, right? So I felt like, okay, let me shock readers in helping them understand the landscape in which running exists. And it's also something that as you move throughout the book, you can return to it to add more context.
Yeah, I think it was just such a striking and powerful, entry into this book. And I have to I shared with you, I have to be honest, like, it wouldn't have been the first book I picked up. And there's a reason behind it. Like, to me, running has always been like this space of like solace and like something that's really personal. It's where I get to escape, right? And it's almost like this thought sheltering that happens for me. So it was really interesting picking up your book, and within like the early pages you talk about like these light bulbs. You start to share some experiences, the identity aspect, body shape. Those are some of the things that I experienced, but never really thought that much into it till today. Like, I probably did think about it at some point and like sheltered it. So, and then kind of moving, it started to have me reflect a bit more as I kind of read through your book. And by the time you get to chapter 20, you remind us that everything is connected. And that was a really striking moment. So I would love for you to like talk a little bit about like why you felt running wasn't meant for us, and how you've been able to like reframe that narrative on who the ideal endurance runner is, especially through Harlem Run.
So much in there. I first want to say everything is connected is my absolute favorite chapter. So thank you for shouting it out. But I too wanted running to be a place of solace for me. It actually saved my life. I was very depressed. I'm starting to tell that story. I was very depressed when I started running. I was overdosing on pills. I was I don't think I really wanted to end my life. I just wanted to wake up like 10 years later when things would be better. So seeing a Black person sharing his journey on Facebook, running a marathon, is the reason why I started running. That representation changed my life and saved my life. And yet, when I went for a run, I recognized that it could not just be a place of solace, because I had to worry about, well, if I'm wearing a sports bra, like, will I be sexualized and could I end up in danger? If I'm running through a white neighborhood, will I be looked at and killed, like Ahmad Arboret, right? So I started to recognize all of the ways that this idea of peace and solace and an escape could not truly apply to Black people in a white supremacist country. I also started to reflect on, okay, there's an industry here, right? It's not just like the community who shows up. There are people making billions of dollars off of us. And all of those CEOs are white. All of the people who own the event companies, the retail stores, the magazines, and the messages that they're sending us are that runners are thin white people. Yeah. There's actually a study that I share in the book that shows that during the years that I started running, so during 2012 to like 2016, there was not a single Black person on a cover of Women's Running, Runner's World, or Canadian Running Magazine. So the images that we get are that runners are white. And what that means then is when a Black body, when one of us is moving, it's not normalized, right? So I would love for running to be just one thing for me, but it's both powerful and amazing, and also filled with fear and worry. And when Black people are killed, there are moments when I may not want to go outside for a run, or when I rethink whether I can live without running because of the danger that it could pose to me.
Wow, that's really powerful. You touch on that element of, I know running, I think I started running cross country in 7th grade, and I was always consistently the only Black girl.
Yeah.
And even like the larger meets, there would just be like specks of Black girls running cross country, but track and field was a different narrative, right? Or even in track and field, you always saw the sprinters were always, Black people or women of color or men of color. So that's always just an interesting, it was just an interesting reality. And I think reading this book kind of brought a lot of that to the forefront, that I may have just, wanted to like protect my mind around.
Right. Well, we take it for granted, right? It's sort of like, oh, I guess Black people are just better at sprinting and jumping, right? First of all, that idea itself is rooted in eugenics, right? This idea that that Black people have this greater facility because we're closer related to animals, right? Monkeys, whatever. But then also when you look at how cross-country functions, a lot of that is on coaches, right? And a coach can absolutely transform your life. There's so many instances when any adult when you're young can transform your life, right? And the coaches are tending to white audiences. There's so many Black people, myself included, who never even considered, I didn't even think about anything beyond the 400 meters, right? Like I just knew that was white people shit, right? And I didn't ever...
That was the narrative, though, it's true.
Nobody ever told me explicitly, like, this is white people shit. But it just like filters into your consciousness, and coaches reify that idea. When you show up to cross-country meets, it reifies that idea. So I'm glad that sort of triggered something for you, because we often take things like that for granted. We also often take for granted, this is something I talk about in Everything is Connected, but there are regularly lists of the best places to run in the United States. Runner's World published one recently, and they even published the demographics, which to me is like so wild that they then didn't comment on it. But they posted places like Flagstaff, like Eugene, like Seattle, all of which have 80% white people. The median income is over $500,000, right? And so there was no commentary that the best, cleanest places to run are places that have an overrepresentation of white people. Do we just think that white people like nicer places, right? Like, no, this is a reflection of historical and present racism and institutionalized practices of zoning and redlining, right? Like all of that is showing up in who runs and who feels like they are a runner.
Well, I think the gravity of that is pretty, like, it's not just going out for a simple run. There's so many things that you need to be thinking. Okay, you touched on this, and I think it's a really important conversation to bring to the forefront, which is the reality of, like, that reality you shared in terms of the tragedy with Ahmad Arbery's killing. I know personally that was a huge it brought about a lot of anger for me at that time, and I'm sure for many in the room, because it felt very personal, right? Like, I grew up running in neighborhoods where many of the people didn't look like me, and it felt like it could have been a brother of mine or a friend of mine or, you know, anybody in that sense. So I want to maybe talk a little bit more about, like, this dialogue around finding freedom. We've been kind of unpacking it a bit, but why it requires the voice of everyone, including our allies, because it's not just a story or a narrative that you and I or, you know, people of color should be amplifying, but why is it everybody's responsibility to, like, really talk about this freedom that's found in this and be allies?
Yeah, I want to start with the impact of Ahmad Arbery. So my son at the time, I had my son in July of 2019, and I once again had depression. I had really bad postpartum depression and anxiety. So I never wanted to leave the house, never let anybody touch my son, which meant that I was so exhausted, but not even my husband. I'd be like, no, you're going to kill my son. So it was very hard times. Then finally in February, I was just starting to feel like myself and just starting to go outside. And then I learned of the murder of Ahmad Arbery. And I talk about that in the book. I was literally like nursing my son, and I read this article about Ahmad Arbery being murdered, and then I go to social media to see if anybody's talking about it, right? Because I'm like, whoa, like, this guy was murdered on the run. It was also a moment within running that there was a big conversation about runner safety, and there was a group that had established this Runner Safety Awareness Month. But all the attention was being paid to white women, right? There were several covers of magazines that talked about safety for white women and what that means, and Ahmad was not seen within the context of runner safety. So I started reaching out to other Black people, and we were all like, yeah, damn, this is crazy. Like, this is why we run in the morning when it's light out. This is why we run in groups. This is why we make sure that we're always in reflective gear, right? So that people know, or friends who say, like, I run with my Columbia shirt, so they know that I am, like, a student somewhere, that I, like, have gone to a school. So I shared on social media just in anger and frustration, because I saw that this could one day be my son. Like, where are you? Like, did nobody else hear that this man was killed while running? Where's the media? Where's the outrage? And that really was a watershed moment for opening the eyes of the industry and recognizing that they genuinely did not see this as a running story, right? They, despite the fact that he was running, this because media is so used to the idea of, like, a Black person running is running from something, having done something, right? This feeding into this idea that he was part of some criminal narrative and therefore deserved it. So that really led me to write this book. And the other piece of that is that I am hopeful, right? I do believe that runners and people in the running industry love running and want more people to be part of it, right? That is, I absolutely find that to be the case. But what I find is that they don't recognize that there are barriers that people have to entering and feeling welcome in the sport, right? So this book, for many, was eye-opening in, you know, talking to store owners and realizing, wow, yeah, all of my staff is white. All of the imagery on the walls is white people. This one store in DC, everybody who showed up for the run was white. DC is one of the blackest places in this country. Like, how, right? But not recognizing, not having the self-awareness to recognize what the community actually looked like and who the community was failing.
Yeah, wow, that's a really good, I'm just thinking about that. That's a really good point. I'm thinking back to, like, high school. I actually still go to the store to buy my running sneakers today. But I lived in a neighborhood where, you know, Union, it's kind of like in the middle. It's not like it's urban. It's kind of in the middle of, like, near Newark, near Maplewood, near Milburn. So like it's in the middle of a hodgepodge, right? But you bring up a good point because I'm just thinking now, like we would go to Milburn to buy our sneakers, but now thinking into it, like I don't ever recall there being like a sneaker store that
Well, there
we
probably
could
was
go
a
to
sneaker
in,
store
in like Newark.
that sold
too.
like Jordans and
Yes,
basketball
there were those, but not
shoes.
running, but not running,
Exactly.
not a specific running
Exactly.
store.
Exactly.
Oh, wow. Again, like these little things that we're not even like, it's just, you're responding, you're not really stopping to like reflect
Well, you know,
into
because,
it.
and I talk about that in this world, right? I mean, in this book, right? That we live in a white supremacist world, right? Where whiteness is the default, where whiteness is highly valued. And so even we as Black people buy into that, right? Like a lot of what I have to regularly like tell myself mantras like, you is smart. But I mean, really, right? Because we are constantly receiving messages that we're not worthy. I'm really impressed with the racial diversity in this room. Shout out to the groups that put this together. But this was absolutely not, you know, when I went to Columbia my 3 times, my classrooms did not look like this. But yeah, we're constantly bombarded with messages about being dangerous or not being capable, and so you just start to, you know, drink the water, right?
Yeah. I want to maybe, before we shift gears a bit, talk a little bit more about the work you're doing with Running Industry Diversity Coalition. What inspired that, and like, how are you working through that organization to amplify a more inclusive narrative around running?
So the Running Industry Diversity Coalition started in July of 2020. So Ahmad Arboret had been murdered in February. You know, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, right? And we were all, of course, in COVID time, so these stories were even more prominent. And a group of running retailers, 3 white running retailers, wow, say that 3 times, reached out to me and said, you know, we had never recognized that there might be a difference running in a Black body versus a white body, and we think it's our responsibility to do something about it. Would you like to join us? And I was like, hell no. Like, you just now realize this, and you want it to be my job to help break down this system you're part of, right? So I was like, nah, I have a 1-year-old, I'm not into it. But they kept reaching out, and it was clear that they completely had no idea what they were doing, which was also fascinating to me. Like, you want to spearhead this group, and you have absolutely no knowledge of the subject matter. So and I talk about this in the book, a lot of our conversations were really stressful, where, you know, there were simple things like not being willing to use the word white supremacy, not feeling comfortable saying that somebody was racist or recognizing that systems are racist, because they were caught up in this idea of, if you're racist, you're bad, right? I know a lot of good racist people because the idea is it's about a system that you gain privilege from, right? I always say, like, I'm able-bodied, and I am ableist in a lot. My events are not always spaces where all bodies can show up, right? Because that is the norm. It's easiest to not create space for people with disabilities because we don't, you know, I don't have the resources, don't have the knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. So I try to make white people feel better about, like, being racist, understanding that it's not a matter of being good or bad. But anyway, so these were the really difficult conversations, and we finally came to the point of recognizing that this group could hold the industry accountable to their DEI statements, to their promises of equity. And we focus, we're now 2 years in, and the group largely focuses on workshops, educations, and trainings. But then there's 3 pieces. So workshops, trainings. The second is doing research, because we know that the industry is very white and that power is concentrated in very few white hands, but we don't have the data to back that. So we're undergoing the first ever research to get that data so that we can then track our progress and hold the industry accountable. And the other piece is looking at talent pipeline. What you often hear, I'm sure folks in this room, is like, yeah, we would love a more racially diverse group, but they just, you know, they just don't apply, or there just aren't enough talented Black folks. We know that's not true. Sort of plugging holes there and making it easier for people to find and cultivate talent.
So what does success look like?
For me, and I think Oprah said this, but it's about the impact every life you touch. I love being in community with folks and chatting with people, even having disagreement and confrontation, because I think that that's a wonderful way to grow. So for me, I mean, writing this book, which is like a very solitary process, took 2 years, and then having the opportunity to speak with different folks and hear how this lands with them. People are saying this book is like life-changing and one of the most important books you'd ever read, right? And that to me is success, right? Because that means that people are going to take action or start to see the world differently because of what I'm doing.
I love that. I want to maybe shift gears with the few minutes we have left before we open it up for questions to talk more about like leadership and ethics, obviously in line with this being part of the Bernstein. So running, those of us who are in here, we can attest to how it cultivates discipline, endurance, all these different skill sets that are really integral to be a leader. How has running helped to contribute and shape your leadership skills?
It's a great question. So I was always a leader, I guess. My father gave me this nickname when I was very young, Powdered Feet, which comes from a Haitian Creole saying. It describes somebody who's so active you never see them, just the footprints of where they So we would go, and my brother was the complete opposite. So we would go to events, they'd need a volunteer, I'd like run to the stage and my brother would be like, so I've always been that way, but what I found was that running changed my life, and then I wanted to share it with everyone. And the founding of Harlem Run really was like my leadership training, right? Because the name of Harlem Run initially was Powdered Feet Run Club, which I thought was like super cool. Nobody came. People were like, what is Powdered Feet? Who cares? And like, you don't have the time to tell people like, oh, it comes from my nickname and it's so special and you should join me. So I very quickly realized like, okay, wow, people, when you're creating community, it's not about a person, it's about the space that you create and the values. And so that was one. So I was like, okay, change the name to Harlem Run, which there's a story to that you can read. The other piece that I realized was that if I wanted to, that a culture is going to happen whether you actively take part in creating that or not, right? So being very intentional about the language that I was using on Harlem Run, being intentional about what body sizes I was showing, never making it about the time or the thing that the person did, but what it meant to that person, their why, and what it brought out in them. I also recognized that, I started getting curious and learning about transformational leadership versus transactional leadership, and I've always led in a way that, like, if you love this and it lights you up, like, I want to know what you want to bring to it, right? Mm-hmm. And then I want to help you bring that thing to this, right? So I very quickly saw that there were people in the group who were leaders, who loved this thing I was building as much as I did. One of whom is my husband now. And I was like, okay, like, let's create a leadership team, right? And what does this look like? What lights you up? Like, how can I support you? And some of those people have gone on to create their own movements and do their own things, which is awesome too, right? I think for me, life is all about like finding your purpose and finding your people. And everything that I've learned about how to be an empathic leader, create new leaders has just come from things that I've picked up on the run, which is why I'm not going to go to business school, because I feel like I have that.
I love that. Okay, let's switch gears and maybe talk about the ethics side of running. Because the one thing about running, yes, it's interesting. You're spending a lot of time with yourself. It's you, it's the road, it's your mind. If you cheat, you're only cheating yourself. Like marathon training. If you decide you're going to be cutting the mud, like if you're supposed to go up to a certain distance and you're like, oh, I'm going to shave that off, you will feel it on marathon. If you didn't get to your I don't know what distances people have decided to go up to. I think the last one I ran, I went up to 22.
Yeah.
The one before that, I did not go up to 22, and I felt the difference, right? So I guess what would you say, how has running and being a leader, like you just mentioned, of Run Team brought ethics to the forefront of your life in general?
Yeah, I don't really think of it as cheating. I think of it as like doing what your body needs, right? But the thing is that you learn that there are consequences for that, right? So running is always teaching me something. It's teaching me patience. It's teaching me also that you're not meant to always be the same, look the same, have the same body, right? I think that is a lesson that is like very hard, something that was very hard for me to learn. Like I gave birth and I was like, I'm gonna snap back, and I was like, because that's the message you receive. And like RIP to that Alison is no longer with us, right? But so now as I run, I'm a whole new person running, and running is teaching me that it can still be there for me, just in a different way, right? I think, and this whole piece about cheating, I was being funny, but truly, I think that with running something where when you put in the work, you get out what you put in. I think it allows you to then actually be kind to yourself and recognize that sometimes the goals or expectations that I set for myself are not for right now, but that's not always, right? Like there are actually gonna be thousands of people who do not finish the New York City Marathon this weekend. And I wouldn't see that as a failure. I think that they're gonna learn so much from that and be able to apply it to new situations. And that's a lot of how I lead my life, right? Like it's not that something necessarily gets easier, but I get stronger. I learn things around the way. I'm able to pivot and not do the same thing again. Like I definitely don't wanna have the same issue again. But it's about constantly learning in this pursuit of something that's actually very impossible. Like less than 1% of the global population ever runs a marathon. So shout out to the marathoners in here. Anybody? Marathoners?
I love that. And another thing is like the preparation up to the race day. That's like
that changed my life, right? This idea when I was very depressed and I signed up for this marathon, that this coach gave me a 16-week training plan and guaranteed I would run a marathon. And a part of me wanted to be like, nope, you don't know me. Not this one, right? But the idea that like there's, in this world where there's so little you can control, if you put in the inputs, you get the outputs. I loved seeing from week to week, I could do things that I couldn't do a week before. And I was able to apply that to other aspects of my life, like finding a job, right? Creating a timeline of, all right, I'm gonna take the next 8 weeks. I created an Excel spreadsheet, and who was I talking to, right? Like recognizing that something that's really difficult and impossible, when you break it up into smaller parts, it's totally attainable. And I think, right, like not everybody wants to be a marathon runner, but the idea that sport and movement can teach such important lessons is something that I know for my son, I want him to be engaged and learn all of that from a very young age and set him up for success.
I love that. I think this is our last question. So I'm gonna combine my last two into one. So what advice would you give our future leaders here, both runners and non-runners, on how to lead successfully and inclusively? And also, how can runners who are not Black show up as allies for other fellow runners?
I love that I get to give you all advice. Many of you probably have like far more life experience than me. But I think for me, I always want to remain curious and recognize that there's far more that I don't know that I do know. And this came for me from getting my master's in counseling psychology. And when you're in a room with somebody, the best thing you can offer them is of course, like your presence, but then your curiosity, right? Because there were times when somebody would say like, man, I've had a really rough week. Rough week? What does that mean to you? Right? Like, because otherwise we're just applying our own lived experience and our own perspective, and even sometimes language, like somebody's using a word that you assume means something else, and then you find out, oh, actually it's a good thing, right? So curiosity, I think is just so important, and curiosity allows you to be empathic, to take intentional action, And the same is kind of true for allies, right? I think that same curiosity. But when you are in rooms where you are the only person who looks like you, do something about it, right? Like, you are empowered to say, wow, all white men in this room, like, what is that about, right? Because we're not going to be in those rooms. And you could just as easily not say anything because that's how the system is designed to work. So be mindful of who's in the room with you and when you can provide opportunities for other deserving folks to get into that room.
Oh, I love that. Okay, and this is the end. So on the behalf of the Bernstein Center, we'd like to thank you and everybody in here for joining us for this.
Oh,
Really?
Q&A.
Oh yes, I jumped the gun. It's okay. Q&A. I was just prepping. Q&A.
Yeah, so thanks so much for being with here, Alison, and sharing your book. Wanted to ask you on the publishing side of things. This is a new foray for you, so congrats on your first book. Tell us more about how you went about this project, so that you're a contributor to some sites and blogs prior, and of course you have like multiple degrees. Was it about drafting a book proposal, then finding an agent? Tell us more about how that worked.
Yeah. So I had, all my life I've wanted to write a book. So several years ago I had reached out to different agents. So I already knew this one agent and I started working with her, and the first thing was to write a book proposal. So I was working on my book proposal, never having done this before, and she was not giving me great feedback at all. She was like, yeah, you're not quite there yet. Try harder. And I was like, wonderful, at this thing I don't know what I'm doing. And I just so happened to be in conversation with a friend of mine, Lauren Fleshman, who has a book coming out. She's was an elite athlete, and she was telling me about her experience with her agent, and she was saying that he was like helping her along the way, and they were working on it together. And I was like, what? So she introduced me to her agent, and it's so funny. The first thing he said is, the first thing you're going to do is never talk to that lady again. So I got this book agent, and he helped me draft the proposal, because an agent's job is to get you a book deal so that they can get paid. They don't get paid unless you get the book deal, right? And it's like with everything else, like whether you're taking a GRE, a GMAT, I don't even know if those tests still exist. It's not about what you know, it's about how you prepare for the tests, right? So he helped me put together this book proposal. Then he sends the book proposal out to publishing companies. And when you have an agent, that gets you on the top of their list. So if you were just to submit via their email, it would take years potentially, right? So this was all during COVID. So I then got 4 meetings with the publishing companies. You meet with the editor who would own your book. I took these meetings with my son sleeping on my chest through Zoom. And it's funny, man, like editors can be so mean. My book proposal was 20 pages, and sometimes book proposals are like 50 pages. And this person said, I just couldn't get a sense of what this book was because it was so short. And I was like, why take the call then? But I was lucky. I got offered 2 book deals. I took the one with the most money. And then typically you get a year to write the book, and then it takes a year to make the book. I've turned in my last draft actually end of April, and the book got made very quickly in whatever that 6 months is. But yeah, if anybody wants to write a book, I highly recommend, it depends on what impact you want to make, right? Like for some people, self-publishing is wonderful, but finding the agent and then an editor who also really was invested in this book was everything for me.
Now that the book has been published, if you think about it now, is there anything that you wish that would have been in the book that didn't make it, or that you wish that you would have known about as far as when you wrote a certain part of the book?
I thought you were going to ask what's next, and I was like, don't do it. Because we're still in this. Yeah, I mean, there's so many stories, right? Like, I really wanted to tell more stories from my childhood, but my editor was like, okay, that's great, but we got to get to the running. Because I think so much, as I was writing this, like, you just remember moments that were small, but had a deep impact in building the person that you were. So, I mean, there was this one story of this. So I went to the school, Dwight Englewood, which is a private school in Englewood, New Jersey, and then there was this public school literally on the other side of the tracks called Dwight Morrow. There's a lot of history in that town about racial segregation, and so Dwight Morrow was Black and Latinx kids. Dwight Englewood was the school on the hill with mostly Jewish kids. Did anybody go to Dwight Englewood? This room? There's usually one. But so the story that I told is that it was so weird that the administrators at Dwight Englewood decided that we would form this coalition called the Dwights, and we would do this exchange program between a subset of kids from Dwight Englewood, a subset of kids from Dwight Morrow. So a bunch of white kids and me from Dwight Englewood spent the day at Dwight Morrow, and a bunch of Black and Latinx kids spent the day at Dwight Englewood. And there was no conversation about race or class. So the white kids were all like, oh my gosh, like scared of the Black kids, right? And then I was there like with my people, but they assumed that I was one of them, right? It was just this like completely bizarre scenario that is not uncommon, I think, for a lot of us growing up, where parents are, where faculty, staff, parents are ill-equipped, don't have the language to talk about these issues, want to do something good. So I thought that was like a really powerful story, and my editor was like, hated it. So there were a lot of things like that. But, you know, I think the book is better for it.
Wilson, and then we'll go to you.
So, on the subject of community, which
Yeah.
you spoke about earlier, I think about like some of the Harlem run, like Monday night runs that they do every Monday at 7.
Yeah.
And you have these group runs where even the neighborhood is kind of cheering you on
Yes.
as you're going through, right? What does it mean for you to both build that community and kind of experience it, like for runners and outside?
That is my absolute favorite thing, and I always remind myself that the running community is not just about those who run, it's about the community that we're running through, right? And I love, like, kids will join us and try to race us, and people will scream like, "You're too slow!" Like, but that's community, right? And that's something you don't experience on the Upper East Side, and that is the difference when I'm talking about between a white space and a Black space, right? A white space that I describe as being what's the word? Well, less communal, for lack of a better word, and more uptight, more internal focus, right? And Black and brown folks, we have this like shared way of seeing each other. And that's one of my favorite things about Harlem, my favorite things about Harlem Run, my favorite things about Black people. Like, we see each other. Sometimes I'll see people on the street and they say hello with like so much warmth that I'm like, do I know you? Right? But that is like just one of the greatest gifts about being us.
So like running is an amazing sport that brings a lot of people with diverse backgrounds together to do something really cool, right? And if you look at the running landscape in New York City, it's very diverse, but you look at the running clubs, if we're honest, they tend to be of a very specific demographic. And you know, you go to the meets, there's kind of like the, you know, ethnic minorities here, white people here, like there's no interaction really going on. And so what I'm wondering from your perspective and view is, how does that change?
Yeah, I think, well, the first thing is like that many white people don't even recognize that it's a thing, right? Which is, I published this op-ed before writing this book that talked about the racial divide in running, and people were like, oh my gosh, I never realized. It's like, you never realized everybody was white showing up. But I think a part of it is just about the culture of those spaces, right? Like, I've shown up to mostly white groups and felt like I wasn't seen, felt like I wasn't embraced, nobody would talk to me necessarily. And again, the culture was not this like warm, welcoming space. I think that it's, you know, Black, brown, Asian runners, like, we don't actually need white people to do the thing that we love. But I would encourage white people to figure out ways to make their spaces more inclusive, right? And part of that, a simple thing like November Project is this group where, anybody heard of November Project? Okay, they actually have groups all over the world. They used to call those groups tribes, right? Talk about problematic. They've since changed that. But the way that leaders of the groups were assigned was just like, okay, I no longer want to be a leader. I'm going to pick my friend Ijeoma, right? And so leadership was just handed down to people who looked like them, people who they were friendly with. And so you had this leadership team globally that was white, right? Even in places like Hong Kong, it was all transplants, it was white folks, right? So looking at, okay, well, what is the selection process and criteria, and how can you get diverse talent in leadership, and then that talent can start controlling the narrative and the look and feel, right? Where are you meeting? If you're meeting in places like the Upper East Side exclusively, well, then you're gonna get just that type of community, right? So there are absolutely things that must be done, particularly since demographics are changing. And a friend of mine once said, if you're speaking only to a white audience, you're speaking to a shrinking crowd, right? So.
Well, that was our last question, and now I'm going to do the on the behalf of the Bernstein Center. We'd like to thank you, Alison, and everyone in here for joining this really important
We have to do one thing. We do a selfie at the end. So I'm gonna sit there. You can jump, or we can squat here. Everybody's gonna hold up their books.
Also, if you'd like to run with Alison and the CBS Running and Triathlon Club tomorrow night at the Harlem Run House, scan this and sign up.
Yes. Like, take it.
I can take
Okay,
it.
cool.
Can we just take a photo? Or
It has to be so everybody hold up your books. We're gonna be here.
Okay, I'll try and selfie first. Come on, get in.
Oh yeah, I guess getting up would be easier. Yeah.
We need community here. We all like each other. Feel it.
As close as is comfortable. Okay.
You try to selfie first, and then.
Okay, cool.
All right, come on, we like each other. Close up.
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever helps.
Stand out.
I don't have that skill. That's why I gave it to you.
Let's see if I have it. Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Oh, ready? 1, 2, 3. I'm gonna take a few.
Oh, it's awesome.
All right, everyone say Harlem Run.
Harlem Run!
All right, I'm gonna take one.
Okay. That was so good though.
Ready? Oh my God, this is awesome. Woo! The campus groups link is coming up. One more. Perfect. Thank you, everyone.